As we continue looking at ethical models that are part of the fifth component of leadership, the norms, values, and ethics of leadership, we are going to look in this segment at justice as fairness and the theories of justice that are really based around the work of John Rawls, who is who wrote the theory of justice in 1971. So to give you the little bit of a background, his picture's in color. He was a Harvard professor. I know people who had him in class at Harvard. And so he is very definitely, even though he is deceased now, he is very definitely a late 20th century scholar who focused on the social contract, as we'll see. Rawls' theory is based in a concept called original position. And this really was a thought experiment based on the theory of distributive justice. What would make for just distribution of social goods in a society? The answer is justice as fairness. Two principles of this idea of justice, the liberty principle and the equality principle, and we'll break these down. The theory of justice as fairness has roots in the social contract theory and in democratic theory. It differs from other social contract theories in that his view of power, particularly the power of leaders. Hobbes and Locke saw the social contract as a mechanism for political legitimacy, for political power and positional power, really, of leaders. Rawls thought the purpose of the social contract was to develop principles of justice as a group of citizens, leaders, and followers together, a more 21st century conception. Once established, leaders were obliged to protect their followers. Locke influenced Rawls probably the most. This notion of that no leadership is legitimate unless it originates from the state of equal rights, the state of equality. Rousseau influenced him with the idea of the social contract as a constraint of authority, the idea that you can overthrow if need be. This notion of rationality, this is a very rational theory, so it's really based in logic. And for that, he was influenced by another of our early theorists that we discussed, Immanuel Kant, and his belief that human good and was really rooted in rationalism, that human beings are rational creatures. They both define the good as things that any reasonable person would want or a way a reasonable person would act. And again, that goes back to the categorical imperative in some respects. Rawls said that only those citizens capable of reasonableness and rationality should be able to participate in the social contract. One of the core ideas in Rawls is this concept of original position. And again, like the social contract, it's a thought experiment or a hypothetical exercise where you design a society, or in our case, you look at designing an organization where each person enters into an original position, totally blind of his history, personality, strengths, weaknesses, what Rawls referred to as the veil of ignorance. The essential features of this theory, as I said earlier, set apart from other social contract theories, not a blank slate of free and equal like Locke, or the belief in the innate goodness of people like Rousseau, or the belief in the depravity of human beings like Hobbes. The veil of ignorance really is a construct of fair and just principles, an unbiased society, a contract of original position. I like to explain it perhaps in layman's terms, since I'm not a philosophy professor, from the standpoint that if you could, in our world today, trade places with anyone in society, the contract of fair and just, only if all parties have access to all pertinent information. And so if you could basically trade places with anyone in society, that would be original position, and you would be willing to trade places with anyone in society, anywhere in our world today. This is a really good exercise to play with people in your buildings that are in charge of discipline. The idea of justice as fairness is if you were able to trade places, any student interchangeably? Would you treat everyone the same way? Would you apply a veil of ignorance in the way you dispense discipline in your school? So this original position and veil of ignorance are important concepts. How would any rational person address matters of justice in society if they did not know their place within it? Two principles of justice that all would agree on in this original position. So we're going into this original position, trading places with anyone, and that's this greatest equal liberty principle, that first each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive basic liberty compatible with similar liberty for others. Robert Greenleaf, the leadership theorist responsible for servant leadership that we'll talk about later on, applies what he calls a leadership test that's really based on Rawls, and that's the idea of the positive impact on the least privileged members of society. That's leadership in Greenleaf's servant leadership approach, and that's very Rawlsian in its interpretation. The second is the difference principle, equal opportunity principle. Social and economic inequalities are arranged so that they are both to the greatest benefit to the least advantaged. And so there's attached to a position open to all under fair and equity of opportunity. This difference principle, this notion of the equal opportunity principle, is really the rationale that we use for Title I funding, giving more funds to schools that have a higher number of disadvantaged students. It's the same basic philosophical principle that we use for special education, for providing equity, which is very different than equality. It's giving those students additional support, additional resources, and additional opportunities so that we can eliminate that difference. And so you can see Rawls has a very, very significant impact on what we do in the classroom, even on a daily basis. The critiques of Rawls, obviously he's been praised for his restoration of democratic thought from the 1960s political upheavals through to the 1980s. Many critiques of his work is the same of the social contract, the hypothetical and idealistic nature of his ideas. This concept of original position is really difficult to conceptualize and to really apply. It's impossible to understand these principles from Rawls would be naturally developed. But it's also perhaps too heavily focused on rationality. Are all people really capable of being rational? Are humans naturally rational? Do those who are irrational and have no rights or different rights because they are excluded from this notion of justice? And do these ideas fit the diversity of people and the cultures of people all around the world? And so, there have been several more recent iterations of Rawls. The contemporary philosopher Martha Nussbaum has modified a lot of Rawls's ideas as far as how to distribute social goods and how social goods can be accessed and utilized by individuals to whom they're distributed. Her notion of what we call care ethics advocates that focus on the capability that recipients have to utilize those goods to function for the good of society. And the idea of human dignity, distributive justice goals, distributed to benefit the dignity of all people. These are very closely tied to many of the ideas that we think of in working with underprivileged people, people with disabilities, and the kind of things that we talked about momentarily. So how do we apply Rawls's ideas to the 5 components of leadership? Well, the leader in Rawls's theory really promotes pure justice and fairness. They're collaborative and democratic, very follower-focused, very much a two-way street with leaders and followers together that are equal. They work collaboratively in pursuit of goals. Distributive justice, in some respects, is another way of saying distributed leadership. And so the context and culture are significant considerations. This is overall a very balanced approach away from, among all the 5 components, probably the most balanced approach that we've talked about thus far.